Hello, and welcome to Basics for Gamers presents Starfinder Basics of Starships Part 4, Pilots. In Part 2 of the series, we discussed how starship combat is structured in phases with specific roles determining when players can act. And in this video, we're going to focus on the helm phase of combat and the role of the pilot. Before we get into the pilot role, let's review the rules for moving through space. There are two stats that form the foundation for piloting, and those are the ship's speed and its maneuverability. Looking back at our sample ship, the Kevlar Venture, we see it is rated as Speed 6, Maneuverability 1. The speed score is synonymous with a character speed score, except instead of it listing how many feet you can move with an action, it lists the number of hexes you move with a typical action. And just like with movement on the personal scale, there are ways to increase or decrease that speed score. Maneuverability lists the number of hexes the ship must move forward before turning one facing of its hex. The act of turning is free and does not consume a point of movement from the ship's speed score. And the big difference between people and starships is that facing rules apply to starships. Each hex has 6 edges that the starship can face into. So if our Kevlar Venture is facing relative north, and wants to turn to face southeast, it must move 1 square north, then turn 1 facing clockwise, then move 1 space forward again, and then turn 1 more facing clockwise. The act of turning does not count against the ship's speed score, so in this example, the Venture has a speed score of 6, and so far it has moved only 2 hexes. Therefore, it may continue moving for another 4 hexes if it wishes. A ship with poor maneuverability, like a colossal warship, must move 3 hexes forward for every facing it turns. And a ship with perfect maneuverability is listed with a score of 0. What this means is the ship is agile enough to move around a single point. This does not mean that it never leaves its hex though and can just spin in place, but quote, perfect maneuverability instead means that it can move 2 facings for every 1 hex of movement. So a ship with perfect maneuverability can pick a corner of its hex and fly around it. Forward momentum still requires it to move, but it can make incredibly tight turns. Also be aware that since a hex of space is an undefined size but very, very large, starships are allowed to move through spaces occupied by enemies, but are not able to end their turns in the same space. Doing so provokes a sort of starship attack of opportunity that will be discussed in our next video that is all about the gunner role. Pilots take their action during the helm phase of combat, and their most basic option is simply called fly. When a pilot takes the fly action, they may move the ship up to its speed and turn as allowed by its maneuverability. Doing so does not require any skill checks. The second option available to pilots is called maneuver. When taking the maneuver action, the pilot attempts to make a sharper turn than usually allowed. In game terms, they make a piloting check versus a DC equal to 15 plus 1.5 times the ship's tier, and if successful, the ship's maneuverability rating is reduced by 1 for the rest of that round. For example, during the helm phase of combat, the pilot of a Kevlar Venture could spend their action to take the maneuver action, and if the total of their piloting check is 16 or higher, then they have perfect maneuverability that turn and could easily turn to any facing they wish. With at least 6 ranks in the piloting skill, the pilot can take the full power action. This allows the pilot to increase the ship's speed by 50% for 1 round, but also increases its maneuverability rating by 2. So if the pilot of a Venture used full power for that helm phase, its speed would increase to 9, but its maneuverability would also increase from 1 to 3, making it much more difficult to turn. This is a push action and may not be attempted if the ship's engines are malfunctioning or wrecked. And using full power does not require a skill check, but does cost 1 resolve point. And if the pilot has at least 12 ranks in piloting, then they can spend a resolve point to perform Audacious Gambit. This is the ultimate Han Solo action and lets the ship move up to its speed while lowering its maneuverability rating by 2. And this movement may pass through enemy hexes without provoking any free attacks. Also, at the end of the movement, the pilot may rotate the ship to face any direction they wish. Attempting an audacious gambit requires a piloting check versus DC equal to 20 plus 1.5 times the ship's tier. If the pilot fails that check, they instead move as if they had taken the basic fly action, but still lose the resolve point that they had spent. And the last action a pilot can take is called Stunt, and there's a lot to unpack there. Stunts are specialized maneuvers a pilot can use in combat. There are several different kinds of stunts, and they're all very situational with their own rules. We'll look at each of them in turn, starting with back off. When using the back off stunt, the pilot slams the ship into full reverse. This requires a piloting check versus a DC equal to 10 plus twice the ship's tier. If successful, the ship moves up to half its speed in the aft direction. On a failed check, it only moves back 1 hex, and if failed by 5 or more, then the ship remains in its original hex and suffers a -4 penalty to both armor class and target lock until the start of the next round. Also note that a ship cannot turn at all while backing off, so whatever direction the ship is facing at the start of the turn will be its facing at the end of the turn. The second stunt is called barrel roll. When doing a barrel roll, the ship only moves half its speed, but flips so that its port weapons and shields face the starboard direction, and its starboard weapons and shields face the port direction. Forward and aft shields are not affected, and the ship's facings return to normal at the start of the next round. Attempting a barrel roll requires a piloting check versus 10 plus double the ship's tier. On a failed check, the ship still moves half its speed but does not roll. If failed by 5 or more, the ship also suffers a -4 penalty to armor class and target lock until the start of the next round. Also note that due to the nature of this stunt, only ships that are size large or smaller may attempt it. The third stunt is called evade. As the name implies, when evading, the pilot is going fully defensive. The pilot rolls their piloting skill versus 10 plus double the ship's tier, and if successful, the ship moves and turns at its normal rate, but also gains a +2 circumstance bonus to both armor class and target lock until the start of the next round. If the pilot fails this check, the ship still moves and turns as normal, but does not receive any bonuses. And if the check fails by 5 or more, the ship moves as normal, but suffers a -2 penalty to both armor class and target lock until the start of the next round. Next we have flip and burn. This stunt allows a ship to turn 180 degrees while moving forward in a straight line. It requires a piloting check versus 15 plus double the ship's tier, and if successful, the ship moves directly forward up to half its speed without turning, but at the end of the move, the ship rotates so that it is facing what used to be its aft firing arc. On a failed piloting check, the ship still moves forward up to half of its speed, but does not turn to a new facing. Flyby is a stunt that allows the ship to move safely through an enemy's space. This requires a piloting check versus 20 plus double the tier of the enemy's ship, but if successful, the pilot flies their ship up to its normal speed, but may also pass through no more than 1 hex occupied by an enemy ship. This does not provoke any free attacks from that enemy ship, and the pilot may also designate 1 firing arc of their ship to receive some special treatment during the gunnery phase of combat. This designated arc may fire its weapon during the gunnery phase as if the enemy ship is 1 hex away, no matter how many spaces away it is when the gunnery phase begins. And all of those shots target 1 designated arc of the enemy ship regardless of any actual facings in the gunnery phase. Essentially, the pilot has rolled their ship in such a way while passing the enemy ship to allow any one of its firing arcs to shoot at any one of the enemy's arcs that the pilot wishes. In the narrative, this happens as they pass, but mechanically the attack isn't resolved until the gunnery phase as usual. And although the pilot's ship is allowed to treat one of their weapon arcs as facing a different arc of the targeted ship, their enemy does not receive that benefit. If the pilot of a flyby declares that their starboard weapons are facing the aft arc of the enemy ship, the enemy does not then get to fire their aft weapons at the starboard side of the pilot ship. Okay, so this is a lot to take in, so let's look at an example. The player's ship, highlighted in green here, has its best weapon mounted on the forward arc. The enemy ship, highlighted in yellow, has no shields left in its port arc, which is facing northeast relative to the player's. The player's pilot wishes to move across the enemy and get a shot at his port side with their forward weapon. During the helm phase, the pilot declares they're going to perform the flyby stunt. For simplicity, we'll say the pilots are in a Tier 1 ship and the enemy is in a Tier 2 ship. The pilot rolls a piloting skill check against a DC of 24, 20 plus double the tier of the ship that the pilot wishes to fly past. We'll say the pilot rolls a success and now gets to take a normal flying action. Their ship has Speed 6, Maneuverability 1. First, they move up 2 spaces, then the ship turns right 1 facing, then moves forward another space, and then moves into the enemy's space. Normally, flying through the space of an enemy ship allows that ship's gunner to take a free shot, but this time, since they are using the flyby maneuver, they do not provoke that attack here. Now, while they are in the enemy space, the pilot declares one facing of their ship and one facing of the enemy ship. The pilot picks their forward facing and the enemy's port side shield arc. During the gunnery phase, all gunners manning weapons in the forward arc of the player's ship may choose to take their action as if they were facing the port arc of the enemy ship and at a range of 1 hex, no matter how the two ships are oriented when the gunnery phase actually occurs. The enemy ship, however, does not get to do the same. They must make all of their gunnery checks according to the regular rules and however the ships are actually positioned when the gunnery phase occurs. Flyby does not grant any kind of free attack or bonus action. Those gunners in the forward arc are still limited to their 1 action per gunnery phase, but the advantage is they can act as if they were facing the port side of the enemy ship. The pilot then continues their move 1 hex forward, turns a facing to the right, moves 1 more space, turns another facing right, and then moves 1 more space forward to end their turn. Now the enemy's forward facing is in the PC's starboard arc, and at a range of 2 hexes. During the gunnery phase, the player's forward gunners can choose to attack the enemy's port arc at a range of 1 hex, and all other gunners will have to contend with the current position of starboard versus the enemy's fore and at a range of 2 hexes. And the defending enemy ship does not get to make their attacks as if their port side was facing the player's forward arc. They must act as normal in the gunnery phase with their forward weapons attacking the player's starboard side. If the skill check is a failure, the pilot still flies the ship through the same path that they would have on a success, but they provoke free attacks from the enemy ship, and all gunnery checks are based on final range and facing as usual. Because of this, it's usually best to have the players declare their movement first, what they want to do, and then roll the piloting check to see the result. The next stunt is called Slide, and is probably what you would expect. The pilot makes a piloting check versus 10 plus double the ship's tier, and if successful, they may move the ship up to its speed in the direction of either the port forward edge or the starboard forward edge, while the ship's facing remains forward. If the check fails, the ship moves directly forward up to half of its speed and may not make any turns. And the final stunt is called turn in place. And once more, it probably does what you're thinking. When spending an action to perform the turn in place stunt, the ship comes to a stop and does not leave its hex. Instead, it turns to face any edge of its hex that the pilot wishes. This does not require the pilot to make any skill checks, but if the ship's maneuverability is poor, it suffers a -2 penalty to both armor class and target lock for the rest of the round, and if its maneuverability is clumsy, that penalty increases to -4. Ships with a maneuverability of average or better do not suffer these penalties when turning in place. In this video, we discussed the pilot role in starship combat. Pilots take their action during the helm phase of combat and are responsible with positioning the ship in a way that is most beneficial for the gunners. See part 2 of the series for a refresher on how rounds, phases, and actions work. The pilot relies heavily on the ship's engine system to perform their duties. The faster the engines are and the more advanced, the better the bonus that will be applied to the pilot's skill checks. And damaged engines will impose a penalty to their actions. A ship's speed score represents the number of spaces it can move in a standard action, and maneuverability is the number of hexes the ship must move forward before turning one facing of the hex that it occupies. Remember, a ship with perfect maneuverability does not freely spin in place, but instead gets to turn 2 facings of its hex after moving forward 1 space. We also reviewed the many actions available to pilots. First is the fly action. This is simply moving and turning up to the ship's normal speed and maneuverability. This does not require a skill check, but still takes the pilot's action that turn. The maneuver action requires a piloting skill check, and if successful, reduces the ship's maneuverability by 1 for the rest of the round. And the audacious gambit action allows the pilot to move up to their speed while lowering their maneuverability by 2 and may pass through enemy spaces without provoking free attacks. At the end of the movement, the pilot faces their ship in any direction they wish. Audacious Gambit requires a piloting skill check and costs 1 resolve point. The last of the pilot actions allows them to perform one of several different stunts. The first stunt is called Back Off, and it allows the pilot to slam the ship into reverse and move in the aft direction up to half their speed without changing their facing. When performing a barrel roll, the pilot moves forward up to half its speed, but during the upcoming gunnery phase, they treat their port side shields and weapons as if they're facing starboard, and their starboard shield and weapons as if they're facing port. At the end of the round, the ship returns to its normal facings. Evade allows the pilot to perform the fly action and move up to speed normally, while also receiving a +2 bonus to armor class and target lock. The Flip and Burn stunt lets the pilot turn the ship 180 degrees while moving forward up to half of its speed. Flyby lets the pilot move through a single enemy space and declare one of its weapon facings to be directed at one of the target's shield arcs, regardless of how they may actually be positioned during the gunnery phase of combat. Basically, the ship flies past the enemy and maneuvers in such a way to get its shots off at the enemy's most vulnerable arc, but the results of that attack are not resolved until the gunnery phase. Slide lets the pilot move up to its speed score along either its forward port or forward starboard facings without changing direction. And the last stunt, Turn in Place, lets you turn in place. You do not leave your current hex, but can spin the ship to whatever facing you prefer. Ships with poor or worse maneuverability suffer a penalty while doing so. With that, we'll bring this video to a close. If you found this video helpful, please give us a like, and don't forget to click that subscribe button and bell so you don't miss out on our future videos. Leave us a comment letting us know what topics you would like to see us cover in the future, and we can always be reached through our Twitter and Facebook pages too. If you would like to use some of the maps that we feature in our videos with your own games, you can find them at Maps of Mastery and 0 Hour. Links to those sites may be found in the description. Thanks for watching, take care, and we'll see you soon with more basics for your favorite tabletop games.